With us now is Dani Citrinowicz, former head of Iran branch at the IDF intelligence. Good evening to you.
Good evening, Jacob.
When Israeli PM Prime Minister offers Israel's help in intelligence and security, clearly he has something in his mind, right?
Yeah, I think the Prime Minister is speaking of a two-way approach, meaning that first, if Israel will encounter intelligence in the future that could help the UAE better prepare for future Houthi attacks, I think that he's willing to share that. And I think even more important, the fact that I think Israel is willing to help on the defensive side, meaning that Israel will give capabilities to the UAE to better defend itself from such an attacks.
Now, you would expect that stuff like that would stay discreet, not in a tweet, right?
Yes, I would expect that, but I think it was important for both sides, and specifically to the Israeli side, to show that first it's sympathy regarding the attack, but also the Israeli way of approach, meaning that Israeli really want to go along or to cooperate with the UAE together against the Iranian threat and the proxy threat. I think in that regard, I think it was important to Israel to show that it's in the right camp, meaning supporting the Gulf states and specifically the UAE. But even more than that, I think that Israel really hope that after this kind of attack, the UAE will increase its security cooperation with Israel, specifically against the Iranian threat.
Yeah, one would assume that they had that already, right?
One would assume that, but I think that what Israeli hope for is more, let's say, public cooperation, outspoken, overt one, and not something behind the scene. I think that Israel is really annoyed from the recent reapproachment between Abu Dhabi and Tehran. I think Israel sees that not in a good way, in a way meaning that I think that Israel is really hoping that the UAE will stay in the Israeli camp against the Iranian aggression. But I think in that regard, Israel needs to understand that the UAE has a new, different approach towards the Middle East. And I think that in their mind, reapproachment with Iran and diffusing the tension with Iran really serve the UAE interest in general.
Yeah, well, you know, there was some criticism from the former spokesman of the IDF who also tweeted that might even offend the Emiratis, that the Prime Minister so publicly, offered his help.
Yeah, I agree in a way that we have to understand the sensitive situation of the UAE. You know, in a clear day, you can see from the UAE, Iran, and I think that really they understand the jeopardy coming from Iran itself. And I think that in a delicate situation, they want to cooperate with Israel. They understand the importance of cooperating with Israel on the defensive side, security side, but also the civilian side. But they still want to preserve good relations with Iran. For them, they want to win both worlds in a way. And I think that Israel needs to be very, very alarming in a way that it must understand that the UAE interest not only or not all the time aligned with the Israeli interest regarding Iran.
Now, about Iran and their proxies, did they go one step too far with this bombing in Abu Dhabi?
Well, I think they are going all the time too far, but I think that they continue to do so because nobody is retaliating against that. At the end of the day, when you're looking at the Saudi approach toward the proxies and the Israeli approach toward the proxies and also the UAE, they are, at the end of the day, like I mentioned, they're really focusing on the proxies and not on Iran itself. Nobody is blaming in Iran, and nobody wants to attack Iran in response to the proxy activity. In that way, the proxy has nothing to lose. They continue operating. The Houthis shot missiles continuously against Saudi strategic capabilities, and nothing happened in a way that, yes, the Saudis tried to bomb them, but with the Iranian support, I think they are able to overcome those kind of attacks. But I think even more than that, Jacob, it is important to say that Israel need to look what's going on in Yemen. I think that the Houthis are really highlighting their capabilities, and they're not far. Taking or measuring the distance between Abu Dhabi and Sana'a, if you measure that, they're not too far from Eilat, for example. So I think in that regard, we have to look and to see what things are developing there, because the strategic capabilities of the Houthis are enormous. They're growing, helped because of the help of the Iranians, but also Hezbollah. So in that regard, I think looking into the future, Israel needs to understand that in the future, we might encounter the Houthis as our enemies.
The rules of the Middle East. Dani Citrinowicz, I thank you very much.